The wind howled across the shattered beaches of Normandy. Smoke still clung to the horizon like a dark veil, the remains of a battlefield that had raged only hours before. The sand was littered with twisted metal, burned-out landing craft, and the bodies of men who had fallen the previous day. For the German soldiers watching from the bluffs near Arromanches, it was a sight that defied understanding. Sergeant Karl Weber of the 352nd Infantry Division pressed his binoculars to his eyes, scanning the beach below. The tide was rolling in, dragging debris and bodies alike toward the shore. He muttered to himself, "Wie viele Schiffe?" How many ships? Unable to count the endless line of vessels anchored beyond the surf. From horizon to horizon, the sea was filled with Allied ships, destroyers, troop transports, supply barges, an armada larger than anything he'd ever seen. But something else caught his eye. Out in the distance, a group of ships wasn't unloading troops or firing shells. Instead, they seemed to be constructing something, assembling enormous steel structures atop the waves, massive floating platforms, rising and locking together like pieces of a colossal jigsaw puzzle. Weber lowered his binoculars, blinking in disbelief. "They're building?" he said aloud. The corporal beside him scoffed. "Building what, Sergeant? A city?" The morning sun glinted off the sea, revealing the truth. Barges fitted with cranes were lowering enormous concrete caissons into the water, some as large as apartment buildings. Tugboats guided them into position, anchoring them into place. Nearby, floating roadways began to stretch toward the beach. All the while, Allied landing craft swarmed around them, bringing in fresh materials, engineers, and guards. It looked chaotic, yet somehow orchestrated. Every movement had purpose. Every ship, every crane, every pontoon seemed to know its role in this massive operation. From their observation posts, German officers watched in stunned silence. They had expected the invasion to stall, to collapse under its own weight. The High Command had predicted the Allies would never be able to maintain a steady flow of supplies without capturing a major French port. But what they were seeing now defied every assumption the Wehrmacht had made. "They're not waiting for a port," Weber whispered. "They're making one." Down on the beaches, British and American engineers worked furiously. The noise of hammers, engines, and waves blended into a strange mechanical symphony. Pontoons slammed into place, steel plates were bolted together, and bridges unfolded like metallic serpents stretching toward the horizon. The Germans fired artillery sporadically from their inland positions, but most shells fell harmlessly into the sea. The Allies had air superiority now. Every time a gun flashed, a squadron of fighter bombers swooped down to silence it. The once confident defenders of Fortress Europe were now trapped in their bunkers, watching helplessly as the enemy built an entire harbor before their eyes. By the afternoon, Allied supply trucks were already rolling down newly formed floating roads, unloading ammunition, fuel, and food onto the beach. The impossible was becoming reality. Sergeant Weber couldn't look away. He turned to his men, voice low and grim. "If they can build a port here," he said, "then nothing will stop them." The men stared out at the endless horizon, the sea that once protected them, now transformed into the enemy's greatest weapon. The realization sank in like a stone. The Allies weren't just landing, they were anchoring. By June 9, 1944, the full scope of the Allied engineering miracle had begun to reveal itself. The code name whispered across the beaches was Mulberry. To the engineers, it was a floating harbor. To the German observers, it was madness turned to reality. The sea outside Arromanches was now a living machine, an immense artificial port rising from the waves. The Allies had secretly planned it for months, even building full-scale prototypes along the British coast before D-Day. Now, under the constant threat of Luftwaffe raids and rough seas, thousands of engineers were turning that plan into a working gateway to Europe. Each section of the Mulberry Harbor had a name and a purpose. The massive concrete blocks, called Phoenix caissons, formed the backbone of the breakwater. They stood like giants, each one weighing up to 6,000 tons, hollow inside, but strong enough to resist the Atlantic's fury. Tugboats guided them into position, filling them with water so they would sink slowly and lock onto the seabed. Beside them floated the whale roadways, long steel bridges supported by floating pontoons known as beetles. These connected the anchored platforms to the beaches, allowing trucks and tanks to drive directly from ships to land without ever touching open surf. All day, the work continued, relentless, methodical, unstoppable. Royal Engineers, American Navy Seabees, and Canadian construction units labored side by side, hammering, welding, shouting orders over the crash of waves and the roar of engines. Lieutenant Commander James Harper of the U.S. Navy Seabees wiped the sweat from his face as he supervised a team bolting a whale section into place. "We're building history, boys!" he shouted over the din. "Let's make sure it floats!" Laughter and cheers answered him, but beneath the noise was exhaustion. The men had been working for 72 hours straight. Sleep came only in short bursts, stolen under the sound of air raid sirens and anti-aircraft fire. Above them, the German Luftwaffe struck whenever they could. Dozens of Ju-88 bombers swooped low at dawn, releasing their payloads on the beachhead and the half-built harbor. Explosions tore through the surf, and smoke billowed skyward, but each time, the engineers simply rebuilt what had been destroyed. The Allies knew the stakes. Without a functioning port, the entire Normandy invasion would choke on its own logistics. Every bullet, every tank, every ration had to come across those floating bridges. The success of Operation Overlord depended on Mulberry. From his observation post inland, Sergeant Weber and his men listened to the distant explosions. Through his binoculars, Weber could see the destruction. And yet, by the next day, the structures stood taller, stronger, more complete. It was demoralizing. Every time the Germans believed they'd dealt a serious blow, the Allies came back harder. Weber turned to his corporal. "They rebuild faster than we can destroy," he muttered. "It's like fighting against the tide itself." By June 12th, the port was operational. Cargo ships began docking directly at the floating piers. Trucks rolled across the whale roadways, unloading supplies that immediately fed the expanding Allied front. German High Command couldn't believe the reports. A working harbor where 2 days earlier there had been only open sea? Hitler's generals refused to accept it. They insisted the Allies had captured an existing port, until reconnaissance photos proved otherwise. For the first time, the German officers realized the scale of the enemy's planning. The Allies hadn't simply prepared an invasion. They had engineered an entire infrastructure to sustain it. As night fell, lights from the Mulberry Harbor shimmered across the waves, a floating city of steel and determination. The sea that once divided the world had become a bridge. By mid-June 1944, disbelief rippled through the German lines from Normandy to Berlin. Reports from field observers described an entire harbor constructed at sea, but to the generals entrenched in their belief of German superiority, such claims sounded absurd, even impossible. At a command post near Caen, Major Otto Reinhardt, an officer from the 21st Panzer Division, studied the aerial reconnaissance photos laid out on his map table. The images were clear. Rows of massive caissons forming breakwaters, ships moored in perfect order, and long metallic bridges reaching to shore. He rubbed his eyes in disbelief. This cannot be accurate," Reinhardt said, voice sharp. "No port could be built that fast, not in open water." But the intelligence officer across the table only nodded grimly. "Herr Major, it's real. The Allies are landing supplies directly onto their beachheads. Fuel, ammunition, tanks. They don't need Cherbourg anymore." The room fell silent. For weeks, the German strategy had hinged on one assumption, that without a major port, the Allied invasion would collapse under its own logistics. But now that assumption was being shattered before their eyes. Reinhardt stepped outside, lighting a cigarette as he stared toward the western horizon. The distant rumble of artillery echoed through the humid air. Somewhere beyond that smoke, the Allies were building something that defied the natural limits of war. He thought of the reports from Sergeant Weber's observation post. how the enemy seemed to summon ships, roads, and bridges from the sea itself. "They're turning the channel into a factory," Weber had said over the radio. Inside the German ranks, confusion turned to dread. Word spread that the Allies had not built just one harbor, but two. Mulberry A at Omaha Beach for the Americans, and Mulberry B at Arromanches for the British. Each could handle thousands of tons of cargo every day. Meanwhile, German troops on the front lines witnessed the miracle firsthand. They could see the steady stream of trucks and tanks rolling inland, the unbroken flow of reinforcements that seemed to materialize out of the waves. Private Dieter Schultz of the 716th Infantry Division watched from a hedgerow, binoculars trembling in his hands. "It's like they brought England with them," he muttered. Behind him, his lieutenant scowled. "Stop talking nonsense." But deep down, both men knew it was true. The Allies had solved the impossible problem: how to feed, arm, and move an army across the sea without a single French port under their control. Soon, German morale began to erode. If the Allies could build harbors from scratch, what else could they do? Their air force already dominated the skies. Their tanks rolled endlessly off landing craft. Their engineers were turning the beaches into permanent fortresses. The myth of German invincibility, once so proudly held, was crumbling like sand under the tide. Back in Berlin, Adolf Hitler flew into one of his infamous rages. He accused his commanders of incompetence, demanding they destroy the floating ports immediately. Orders went out for bomber squadrons to strike at the Mulberries with everything they had. But even as the Luftwaffe scrambled, Allied fighters controlled the skies. Every German sortie that made it through faced walls of anti-aircraft fire from ships and beach batteries. The sea around Arromanches became a deadly trap for any pilot foolish enough to dive too low. Still, the attacks continued, desperate, furious, and futile. As Reinhardt's adjutant entered with a new message, he said quietly, "Herr Major, the Führer wants confirmation. Can they truly supply an entire army through that structure?" Reinhardt stared at the map, the red lines of advancing Allied divisions pushing steadily inland. "Not just supply it," he said finally. "They can feed it, fuel it, and replace it." He crushed his cigarette beneath his boot and turned back toward his awa. By June 15, 1944, the Mulberry Harbors were no longer just experimental structures. They were the beating heart of the Allied invasion. From sunrise to sunset, the Normandy coast thundered with the rhythm of machinery. The sea groaned beneath a living network of steel and concrete, carrying the weight of a growing army. At Arromanches, the British Mulberry B operated like a colossal organism. Massive Liberty ships docked at floating piers, unloading cargo with cranes that swung like the arms of a giant. Trucks rumbled down the whale roadways, bouncing over the waves as if driving across a living bridge. Bulldozers and jeeps hurried along, their engines howling above the crash of surf and the drone of Allied aircraft patrolling the skies. Each day, nearly 7,000 tons of supplies moved through the artificial port. Food, ammunition, fuel, medical equipment, and spare parts for tanks and trucks. It was a continuous lifeline stretching across the English Channel. Lieutenant Commander James Harper, the U.S. Navy engineer who had helped assemble the first whale sections, stood on one of the pontoons watching the process. Around him, men were unloading crates of shells marked 105mm, while others guided Sherman tanks off the barges. He smiled faintly, exhaustion lining his face. "Back home," he said to a young corporal. "They'll never believe we built a harbor in the middle of a war zone." The corporal grinned, tightening a bolt on the deck. "They'll believe it when they see us win it, sir." Overhead, waves of Allied bombers roared eastward toward German positions near Caen, their engines shaking the water. The sky was gray with smoke, but the port kept running, undaunted by chaos. Every hour counted. Every crate, every gallon of fuel brought the Allies closer to breaking out of Normandy. Across the Channel, in Britain, supply convoys lined up at embarkation points. Every 2 hours, another flotilla departed. Cargo ships, tugs, fuel barges, and tankers, bound for the floating harbors. It was a choreography of logistics unmatched in history. The Royal Navy called it Operation Neptune's Artery. For the German observers inland, it looked unreal. From their distant positions, the harbor appeared as a glittering fortress on the sea, bristling with cranes and vehicles that never stopped moving. To them, the channel was no longer a barrier. It had become the Allies' highway. Sergeant Karl Weber once again peered through his binoculars. He had seen the beaches before D-Day, calm and empty. Now, they were alive with motion, life, and purpose. The sea itself fights for them, he murmured. Behind him, a weary artillery officer adjusted his radio. Our guns can't reach that far. Even if they could, what good would it do? We destroy one section, they build two more. The Luftwaffe's attempts to cripple the Mulberry Harbors continued, but Allied air cover was overwhelming. German bombers rarely made it back alive. The Allies had turned the skies into a fortress just as impenetrable as their new harbors. Every day, the Allies pushed deeper into Normandy, towns like Bayeux, Carentan, and Saint-Lô slowly falling under Allied control. Each victory was fueled by supplies streaming through those floating docks. By mid-June, 300,000 men had landed, supported by 50,000 vehicles and over 100,000 tons of cargo, all through Mulberry. For the German soldiers trapped in defensive positions, the sight became unbearable. They had always believed logistics would be their enemy's weakness. Now, it had become their greatest strength. Private Schultz said quietly to his comrades, "We thought we were fighting an army, but we're fighting a machine." As he spoke, far out at sea, the Allied convoys kept arriving, endless silhouettes on the horizon, moving toward the shore like an unstoppable tide. And for the first time in the war, the German defenders began to feel something they hadn't known since 1939. The morning of June 19, 1944, began with an uneasy calm. The sky above Normandy was gray and heavy, the sea unusually restless. Allied engineers working at the Mulberry Harbors noticed the wind picking up earlier than usual, the tide growing unpredictable. To most, it seemed like just another rough day on the channel. But by afternoon, nature itself would remind both sides that even the greatest human invention was still at the mercy of the elements. At Arromanches, Lieutenant Commander Harper was on the floating pier when the first massive wave slammed against the caissons. The entire structure shuddered. Tools rolled across the deck. Men grabbed railings as the sea began to heave beneath them. Within minutes, the wind had escalated into a gale, a full-force channel storm, the kind that even seasoned sailors feared. "Secure every line! Double the anchors!" Harper shouted through the howling wind. The men raced to tighten the cables linking the whale roadways to the beetle pontoons. Each link was vital. If one failed, the chain reaction could tear apart the entire harbor. The storm raged with a fury unseen since the landings. Waves, some 20 feet high, pounded the steel structures. Ships broke free from their moorings and smashed into one another. Trucks and cranes were thrown into the sea like toys. On the beach, soldiers scrambled to salvage equipment before the tide swallowed it. The roar of the storm drowned out orders and gunfire alike, an unrelenting natural bombardment. Out to sea, Allied vessels fought to hold position. Tugboats strained against their lines as the massive Phoenix caissons groaned under the stress. The wind ripped through tarps, shredded tents, and turned supply crates into flying debris. In the midst of the chaos, Harper clung to a railing, his face battered by salt spray. He watched helplessly as one of the floating roadways twisted apart and vanished beneath the waves. "God help us," he muttered. "We're losing her." For 3 days, the storm tore at the Mulberries. At Omaha Beach, Mulberry A, the American harbor, suffered catastrophic damage. One by one, the caissons broke loose and drifted away. Entire sections of the harbor disappeared beneath the raging sea. By June 22nd, it was gone, completely destroyed. News of the disaster spread quickly through the Allied command. General Eisenhower received the reports grimly. "Can the British one hold?" he asked. At Arromanches, Mulberry B, the British harbor, had survived, though barely. The engineers had reinforced it constantly, improvising repairs even as the waves crashed over them. Many risked their lives diving beneath the water to re-anchor sections by hand. Dozens were killed, crushed between floating pontoons or swept into the sea. When the storm finally broke, silence fell over the coast. The survivors looked out over a harbor half ruined but still standing. The air smelled of fuel, salt, and sweat. Men stood on the battered decks, exhausted but alive. Harper removed his helmet, staring at the mangled steel around him. "She held," he whispered. "By God, she held." The Germans, too, had watched the storm from afar. From their inland positions, they saw ships tossed like leaves, sections of the harbor vanishing into the surf. For a brief moment, they believed nature had done what their artillery could not. But as the skies cleared and the smoke lifted, the truth dawned again. The British harbor at Arromanches was still operational. Supplies began flowing once more within days. Sergeant Weber, observing through his binoculars, couldn't believe it. "Even the sea fights them," he muttered, "and still they win." The Mulberry at Arromanches had survived, battered but functional. It would continue to serve as the Allies' lifeline for the next 10 months, moving over 2.5 million men, 500,000 vehicles, and 4 million tons of supplies into Europe. The storm had tested man's resolve, and once again, the port that broke the resistance. By the last week of June 1944, the German army was no longer fighting to win. It was fighting to survive. Every day, more Allied troops, tanks, and supplies poured through the surviving Mulberry Harbor at Arromanches. What the Germans had believed would be a temporary beachhead had turned into an unstoppable industrial pipeline feeding the Allied war machine. From Cherbourg to Caen, the German front lines began to crack. What had once been well-organized defenses were now disoriented, undersupplied, and running out of fuel. The Wehrmacht, which had relied so heavily on speed and efficiency, now found itself paralyzed by the sheer volume of Allied reinforcements. At dawn on June 27th, Sergeant Karl Weber's unit took up positions near a small French village west of Bayeux. They had been ordered to hold the line until reinforcements arrived. Reinforcements that never came. The sound of distant artillery echoed like a constant heartbeat. The air trembled under the approach of Allied armor. Through his binoculars, Weber could see them. Endless convoys of trucks rolling inland from the coast, all painted with the same white star. "They come every hour," he whispered to his corporal. "It's like the sea itself is feeding them." Nearby, German soldiers huddled in foxholes, whispering rumors that the Americans had rebuilt an entire harbor overnight, that the British could unload tanks directly from ships, that more men were landing every day than had fought in all of France before. None of it was rumor. It was all true. In Caen, Major Otto Reinhardt received orders to retreat to the south. He stood in the ruins of a farmhouse, listening to the reports from his scouts. "They've advanced 15 kilometers overnight, Herr Major," said a young lieutenant. "The British are moving their supply line straight through Arromanches." Reinhardt sighed heavily, staring at the map on the table. "So this is how an empire dies," he muttered. "Not with bombs or bullets, but with logistics." For the Allies, Mulberry B became more than an engineering triumph. It was the foundation of their momentum. The once risky foothold in Normandy had transformed into a fully functioning front. Every tank that roared into battle at Caen, every Spitfire fueled at a makeshift airstrip, every ration that fed a soldier on the front line, all had passed over the floating bridges of Arromanches. In London, Prime Minister Winston Churchill received reports of the harbor's performance with pride. "Never before in the field of human endeavor," he told his advisors, "has the sea been conquered so completely for the cause of liberation." For German soldiers still holding positions on the bluffs, the sight was unbearable. The ocean, once their strongest defense, had turned traitor. Private Dieter Schultz wrote in his journal that night, "We used to believe the Atlantic Wall would hold forever. Now the enemy walks across the waves as if they were solid ground." The collapse of the German line in Normandy was not sudden. It was systematic. Every day, Allied engineers expanded the floating port, unloading new cranes, more pontoons, and endless fuel drums. Within weeks, Mulberry B could handle more tonnage than any single port in Europe. From that point onward, the German defense in France was doomed. The Allies no longer relied on luck or captured harbors. They had built their own path to victory. In the command posts of the crumbling Wehrmacht, the tone had changed. Orders were no longer about counterattack, only delay. Every hour the Germans held was another hour of survival, but against an enemy that could build ports out of the sea itself, survival was running out. As night fell over Normandy, the horizon still glowed with Allied lights, cranes, ships, and spotlights illuminating a harbor that never slept. The invasion had become a permanent presence. And somewhere, the engineers who changed the war, unsung architects of victory. Amid the chaos of battle, few soldiers paused to think about the men who made the impossible possible. Yet behind the front lines, working knee-deep in seawater and mud, were the unsung heroes of Operation Mulberry, the engineers, builders, and sailors who had built an empire of steel on the waves. At Arromanches, the storm had left scars everywhere. The twisted remains of pontoons and roadways littered the shoreline, but the harbor still functioned. The men repairing it had no medals, no parades, only exhaustion and pride. Lieutenant Commander James Harper stood with a wrench in one hand and a cigarette in the other, overseeing the repair of a damaged Beetle pontoon. His uniform was soaked through, his hands black with grease. Around him, welders worked through the night, sparks flying into the cold air. One of his men, a British sapper from the Royal Engineers, shouted over the clatter of tools, "Sir, that section's stable. She'll hold another week, maybe 2. Harper nodded, too tired to smile. "That's all we need," he replied. 2 weeks becomes a month. A month becomes victory. Every man there understood that the harbor was more than just a collection of metal parts. It was a symbol of Allied determination, proof that ingenuity could defeat tyranny. Across the Channel, in British shipyards, thousands more workers labored day and night to build replacement caissons and pontoons. Welders, dockhands, and engineers worked in shifts that never stopped. The war effort was no longer just fought with guns, but with blueprints, cranes, and the will to adapt. As the Mulberry system stabilized after the storm, the daily throughput increased again. Ammunition convoys rolled inland without pause. Medical ships docked at the floating piers to unload the wounded and ferry them back to England. The entire operation ran with precision that astonished even its planners. Colonel John Stokes of the Royal Engineers wrote in his field log, "The enemy thought they could bomb or shell us into failure. They never understood. We built this harbor to move, to bend, to survive." Meanwhile, German reconnaissance continued to report with growing despair. The Luftwaffe's surviving reconnaissance pilots brought back photos showing the harbor more active than ever. Hundreds of trucks lined up, cranes operating non-stop, and ships waiting in queues offshore. In Berlin, the reports caused fury. Hitler's staff debated the photographs, arguing over how such a thing could exist. One general slammed his fist on the table. "They've turned the ocean into a dockyard," he shouted. Another replied quietly, "No, mein Herr, they've turned it into a factory of war." While the German command struggled to comprehend it, Allied soldiers began calling Arromanches Port Winston, a fitting tribute to the man whose vision had demanded the creation of a floating harbor years before D-Day. On the beaches, the name spread like folklore. "Port Winston feeds us," one American joked. "The sea's working for us now." By July, even local French villagers could see the change. What had once been a quiet coastal region was now alive with movement, trucks roaring inland, cranes clanging day and night, Allied flags fluttering in the sea breeze. The sound of hammers and engines replaced the thunder of artillery. And for the engineers who had built it all, there was little rest. Harper stood at the edge of the pier one evening, watching a convoy of tanks roll ashore. "We were told this would last a week," he murmured to himself. It's been a month. A British sailor beside him smiled. Aye, sir. Guess we overbuilt it. They both laughed quietly, the tired laughter of men who knew they were changing history, one bolt at a time. How Mulberry fueled the breakout from Normandy. By early July 1944, the beaches of Normandy no longer looked like battlefields. They looked like an assembly line. Endless columns of tanks, trucks, and men poured inland, supplied by the heartbeat of Mulberry B at Arromanches. What had begun as a desperate gamble was now the logistical engine driving the Allied advance across France. Every sunrise revealed a new spectacle of motion. Bulldozers widened the beach exits, engineers extended the whale roadways farther toward deeper waters. Liberty ships arrived in convoys guided by patrol boats, offloading everything from fuel drums to field hospitals. The smell of diesel and salt filled the air as cranes swung above the waves like mechanical giants. For the soldiers resting nearby, the sight was almost surreal. American infantrymen, mud still on their uniforms from the hedgerows near Carentan, sat on the dunes watching ships unload. One of them, Private Harold Keene, turned to his comrade and said, "You ever think the sea would be on our side?" His friend shook his head. If the Krauts could see this up close, they'd surrender now. And in many ways, they did see it, through the lenses of terrified binoculars miles away. From their command posts, German officers watched the endless procession of Allied logistics. Every day, new divisions landed, new tanks rolled off barges, and new fuel depots appeared behind the lines. Sergeant Karl Weber, now stationed near St. Lo, received radio reports describing the scene. "Supplies move day and night," the voice crackled. "The beach glows with lights even after dark. They're not just landing, they're multiplying." Weber's reply was quiet. "Then we can't win. Not against that." The truth of his words unfolded in July's battles. As the British pressed toward Caen and the Americans prepared for Operation Cobra, the breakout offensive, Mulberry became their silent partner. Each artillery barrage, each tank advance, each airstrike was powered by the supplies flowing through that floating harbor. Every gallon of fuel that filled a Sherman tank, every shell that left a howitzer, every ration that fed an advancing infantryman, all had crossed the sea on the back of Mulberry. In Allied headquarters, logistics officers tracked the numbers with quiet pride. Since its completion, Mulberry B had handled nearly 1 million tons of cargo. The operation that the Germans once mocked as impossible had now become the lifeblood of liberation. Field Marshal Montgomery himself visited Arromanches that month. Walking along the floating pier, he saluted the engineers and sailors maintaining the port. "Gentlemen," he said, "you have built something greater than a harbor. You've built victory." The storm-battered structures groaned beneath the waves, but they endured. Day and night, the rhythm of cranes, engines, and waves became a steady march toward the inevitable collapse of German power in the West. By late July, the Allies broke through the German defenses at St. Lo. The breakout had begun. Allied armor poured into open countryside, racing toward Paris. Behind them, Mulberry continued to feed the offensive, never stopping, never failing. For German high command, the reports grew more desperate. "We cannot cut their supply line," one general admitted. "They have no line. They have the ocean itself." As Allied convoys rolled across France, the Mulberry Harbor at Arromanches remained behind them, a monument of steel and will, standing defiant against both man and nature. At dusk, as the tide came in and the horizon glowed red from distant fires, Lieutenant Commander Harper stood on the pier, watching another convoy depart inland. The air was heavy with the hum of victory. He took off his cap, staring toward the coast. "All this," he whispered, "built from nothing but an idea and courage." Behind him, the harbor creaked but held firm, a floating testament to the day they knew it was over. By August 1944, the once confident German army in France was on the verge of collapse. The Mulberry Harbor at Arromanches, that strange floating fortress the Allies had built from nothing, had done what no army alone could. It had broken the will of the defenders. From the hedgerows of Normandy to the forests of Falaise, German units were retreating, scattered and starving. Tanks ran out of fuel before even reaching the front. Ammunition was rationed, food supplies dwindled, and the once feared Luftwaffe had been reduced to a shadow. In a makeshift command post near Falaise, Major Otto Reinhardt unfolded his field map. The red lines marking the Allied advance stretched like veins across northern France. Every arrow pointed toward Paris. His adjutant waited silently for orders that would never come. Reinhardt finally spoke, voice low and hollow. "It's over. They've turned the channel into a supply depot. We can't stop that." He walked to the window, staring toward the western sky. Even from miles inland, the distant hum of Allied transport planes could be heard. Endless, rhythmic, unstoppable. The same sea that had protected the Reich now served as the Allies' greatest ally. Reports from field observers confirmed what Reinhardt already knew. The harbor at Arromanches was still fully operational, feeding men and machines into the front without pause. Despite the storms, despite the bombs, despite everything thrown at it, it stood. Back on the bluffs overlooking Normandy, Sergeant Karl Weber and his remaining men watched the horizon for the last time. Smoke from the retreating columns rose behind them. In front of them, the sea glimmered beneath the summer sun. Through his binoculars, Weber could see the Mulberry, cranes still swinging, ships still unloading, trucks still rolling ashore. It was as if the war had long since decided its winner. He lowered the binoculars and sat on the edge of a crater, silent. "You remember when we thought the sea was our wall?" he said to his corporal. The man nodded bitterly. "Now it's their bridge." Weber exhaled slowly, his expression unreadable. "They built their future on our defeat," he murmured, "and they started with the ocean." In Berlin, Hitler's inner circle argued over the meaning of the disaster. Some generals blamed the weather, others the navy, others the lack of fuel. But the truth was simpler. The Allies had mastered something Germany never could. Supply on a scale beyond imagination. Every ton of fuel that fed a Sherman, every crate of ammunition, every loaf of bread, every spare part, all came through the Mulberry Harbor. The Germans had underestimated not just Allied manpower, but Allied innovation. Meanwhile, Allied troops began liberating town after town. Civilians cheered as convoys rolled through, carrying the markings, "From Mulberry." French farmers lined the roads, waving flags as the vehicles thundered eastward. The psychological impact on the German troops was devastating. Wehrmacht soldiers began to surrender in record numbers, realizing that their enemy could replace men and machines faster than they could destroy them. To them, Mulberry was more than a harbor. It was proof of the Allies' inevitability. As the sun set over the wreckage of the Normandy coast, the sea reflected the glow of thousands of Allied lights, cranes, ships, and landing craft still at work. It looked almost peaceful now, but for the Germans who watched it, that peaceful glow marked the end of a war they no longer had the power to win. Sergeant Weber turned to his corporal one last time. "When they write about this war," he said softly, "they'll say we lost it the day they built a port from nothing." He tossed his binoculars aside, the glass cracking against the rocks. The tide was coming in. The wind carried with it the distant hum of engines, Allied trucks still rolling toward victory. The fortress of Uyeyas. Section 10. Legacy of the Impossible. When steel, sea, and will won the war. By September 1944, the Mulberry Harbor at Arromanches had done its duty. The tide of war had moved inland, across France, through Belgium, and toward Germany itself. The floating docks that once roared with the sound of cranes and engines now rested quiet under the gray Atlantic sky. But their legacy was already written, not in stone or steel, but in the liberation of an entire continent. On a misty morning, British engineers gathered on the pier, gazing out over the rusting remnants of their creation. Waves crashed against the caissons, now half sunk into the sand. Seagulls perched on the old bridge spans, the same ones that had once carried tanks and trucks to shore. Lieutenant Commander Harper, the man who had once doubted if the idea would even float, stood with his hands in his pockets. "She held longer than anyone expected," he said softly. "Long enough to finish the job. His sergeant smiled faintly. Long enough to prove we could do the impossible. The Mulberry Harbor had survived storms, bombings, and the skepticism of generals. It had fed the greatest amphibious force in history and turned a fragile beachhead into a permanent gateway to Europe. In London, a logistics officer summarized it in a single line of his after-action report. Without Mulberry, the invasion might have failed. With it, victory became a matter of time. And across the Channel, the Germans understood that truth too late. The same Wehrmacht officers who had once mocked Allied floating toys now studied their designs with a grim respect. Some even wrote in their reports that such a harbor was a feat beyond the capacity of German industry. For the Allied soldiers who fought and bled in Normandy, the harbor became a quiet symbol of what their side represented: ingenuity, cooperation, and determination. Private Harold Keane, months later, would write home about it in a letter to his mother. "They told us we'd land on open beaches. I thought we'd die there. But they built a port on the ocean, right there, out of nothing. It made me believe we could build anything, even peace." As the Allies pushed into Paris and the bells of liberation rang, the Mulberry continued to work, unloading the supplies that rebuilt cities and refueled armies. Even as newer ports on the continent opened, the memory of that first harbor endured. Years later, pieces of the Mulberry would still be visible at low tide. Great blocks of concrete resting quietly along the French coast, monuments to human resolve. Tourists would walk among them, not realizing they were standing on the bones of an invention that had changed history. For the veterans who returned decades later, it was a sacred place. Some would kneel beside the barnacled remains and whisper words only they could understand. Others simply stood in silence, listening to the waves, hearing the echo of cranes, engines, and distant cheers. The Mulberry Harbor was never meant to last forever, only long enough to win a war. But in doing so, it became timeless. It proved that even in the darkest hour of conflict, human ingenuity could turn the tide. That courage and creativity could transform fear into forward motion. That a few floating platforms anchored by hope and steel could carry the weight of freedom itself. As the sun set over the quiet ruins of Arromanches, the sea turned gold, and for a moment it was as if the ghosts of D-Day stood watching, engineers, sailors, soldiers, all part of the vast machine that made the impossible real. And somewhere across that calm horizon, the world they had built began to take shape, free, alive, and forever indebted to a harbor that rose from the waves.